was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Not mine exactly, but my son Mason's wedding. I had spent years imagining this day, standing proudly at the back of the hall, watching him start a new life with someone he loved. I'd pictured it 100 different ways. Maybe I'd cry a little. Maybe I'd laugh a lot. Maybe I'd just stand there and clap until my hands went numb. But nothing in all those daydreams prepared me for what I saw that afternoon. The ceremony was being held in a grand hotel ballroom downtown. The kind of place where the chandeliers sparkled like stars and the marble floors looked like they cost more than my old truck. I wasn't used to fancy places like that, but I wore my best black suit, the same one I had worn when Mason graduated college. I even got my boots polished, the scuff marks hidden, so no one could say I hadn't tried. I stood there for a moment, breathing deep, telling myself I belonged here because I was Mason's father and that meant something. They led me to my seat at the front row, right where family was supposed to sit. There was a little folded card on the chair just like all the others. At first I didn't notice anything strange. I was too busy trying not to trip over the expensive carpet, but when I finally bent down to look, my heart stopped. The name played on my chair didn't say Mr. Daniel Cooper like it should have. It didn't even say father of the groom. No, it said something else. Something that burned itself into my chest so hard I felt like I couldn't breathe. Low-educated fake dad. At first I thought it was a mistake, a sick joke maybe. I glanced around thinking someone would rush over apologizing, swapping it out for the right card. But no one came. And then I heard it, the laughter. Quiet at first, like someone trying to hide it behind their hand, but it grew louder, cruer. When I lifted my eyes, I saw them. Claire's family. The Whitmore. Her mother, Judith, trying to cover her mouth as she laughed. Her father, Dr. Richard Whitmore, smirking like he had just seen a dog wearing a tuxedo. My ears burned. My palms started to sweat. I looked over at Mason, standing near the altar, straightening his cuffs. He hadn't seen it yet. Thank God he hadn't seen it yet. I stood up slowly. My first instinct was to leave, get out of there before Mason noticed, before anyone else had a chance to point and laugh. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't want to move, but I forced them to step away from that awful little card. I made it halfway to the side door when I heard a voice, sharp and clear above the noise. "Dad, wait!" I stopped. I turned around and there he was, Mason, jogging down the aisle toward me, the jacket of his navy blue suit flapping behind him. His face was red, not from embarrassment, but from anger. Real anger, the kind I hadn't seen on him since he was a teenager, and someone tried to steal his bike. He reached me and grabbed my arm, squeezing tight. His voice shook a little when he said, "Dad, let's go home." For a second I just stared at him, too stunned to speak. I could feel every eye in the room on us, waiting to see what would happen next, but when I looked into Mason's face, into those familiar brown eyes that had once looked up at me from a crib, I knew what I had to do. I nodded. Together we turned our backs on the ceremony, on the polished floors, the glittering chandeliers, the people who thought they were better than us. I could hear whispers and gasps behind us, but I didn't care. Mason didn't care either. His hand stayed firm on my shoulder like he was shielding me from every daggered stare in the room. As we pushed through the heavy double doors, I caught a glimpse of Claire standing frozen at the altar, her white dress gleaming under the lights. Her mouth was open in shock. Judith's face was twisted into something ugly, and Dr. Whitmore looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Good. Let them see what it felt like to lose something precious. Outside, the sun was blinding. I blinked hard, trying to adjust. Mason walked a few steps ahead, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. We didn't say a word until we reached the parking lot. I fumbled with my keys for a second, hands still shaking, but Mason took them gently from me. "I'll drive, Dad," he said. I got into the passenger seat like I was moving through water, heavy and slow. As Mason pulled out of the lot, I stared out the window, trying to gather my thoughts. I should have felt humiliated. I should have felt crushed. And part of me did. But there was another part, bigger and stronger, that felt something else entirely. Pride. Mason could have ignored it. He could have let them laugh and carried on with his perfect little wedding. But he didn't. He chose me. He chose respect over appearances, loyalty over show. He chose love. We drove in silence for a long time, the city flashing by in blurs of glass and metal. My mind kept going back to that nameplate, the ugly black letters printed so neat and bold. Low-educated, fake dad. That's how they saw me. Not as a man who had worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. Not as a father who had learned to braid hair with clumsy fingers when Mason wanted to dress up as a superhero with a cape. Not as the man who had sat up all night when Mason had pneumonia, praying to a god he wasn't even sure he believed in. No, just some fool they could laugh at. Mason tapped the steering wheel lightly with his fingers. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally, voice low. "I should have seen it coming. I should have known." "You couldn't have known," I said. My throat was thick, but I forced the words out and you stood by me. That's all that matters. He glanced over and for the first time all day he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real, and it reminded me of all the other smiles over the years. The missing teeth grins, the sheepish teenage smirks, the proud graduation day beam. Smiles that belonged to the boy I had raised. We didn't go home right away. Instead, Mason pulled into the old diner on 4th Street, the one we used to go to after Little League games. It was nearly empty, just a few tired truckers and a waitress wiping down counters. We sat in a booth by the window. Mason ordered coffee, I ordered pie. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. The world outside kept spinning. The whites were probably scrambling to explain why the groom had abandoned the wedding. Maybe they were still laughing at me. Maybe they were cursing me. I didn't care. I had my son. I had the kind of love no degree could buy and no cruel words could tear down. For the first time that day, sitting in that old vinyl booth, I felt at peace. They could call me whatever they wanted. I knew who I was. I was his father, and that was enough. The drive home from the diner was quiet but not heavy. There was a peace between us, the kind that only comes after the worst has happened and you realize you're still standing. As we pulled into the driveway of our little house on Maple Lane, I let out a breath. I didn't even realize I'd been holding. The porch light flickered as it always did. The paint on the fence was chipped and the lawn could have used a trim. But to me it was the most beautiful sight in the world. Mason got out first, unlocking the door like he had done 1,000 times growing up. I followed slowly, my legs stiff from sitting too long. Inside, the house smelled like old leather and coffee. Comfort smells, familiar smells. Mason dropped the keys on the hallway table, shrugged off his jacket, and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't anger. It was sadness, raw and deep. "I didn't mean for today to turn out like this," he said quietly. I shook my head. "You didn't do anything wrong." He sat down heavily on the old couch, the one we had patched together more times than I could count. I sat across from him in the recliner that had been my throne for nearly 2 decades. The same chair where I read Mason bedtime stories when he was little. The same chair where I waited up for him when he was 15 and stayed out past curfew. Memories flooded in, uninvited, but welcome. I remembered the nights we spent on that couch when the power got cut off, wrapped in blankets, eating cold beans from a can and laughing like it was an adventure. I remembered how when Mason was about 8, he'd swear he would grow up rich enough to buy me a real leather recliner. One that doesn't squeak when you lean back, he promised. I told him I liked the squeak. It reminded me the chair was alive, just like our home. I smiled at the memory, and for the first time that evening I felt the weight on my chest lighten a little. Mason leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You ever think maybe I should have just married someone simpler, someone who didn't come with a family like that? I let the question hang in the air. It wasn't my place to tell him who to love. Love wasn't about logic. It wasn't a checklist you could cross off neatly. It was messy, confusing, stubborn. I knew that better than most. Instead of answering right away, I stood up and wandered into the kitchen. I pulled 2 beers from the fridge, cheap ones, the kind we used to split on Saturday nights after working on the truck, and handed one to Mason. He accepted it with a small smile. You loved her, I said finally, sinking back into my chair. You don't get to choose where your heart goes. You just hope it's going somewhere good. Mason nodded slowly, staring at the floor. I thought Claire was different. I thought she loved me for who I was, not for how much I could impress her family. I took a sip of my beer. It was bitter, sharp, familiar. Maybe she did. But love isn't just words, son. It's actions. It's who stands beside you when everything falls apart. He looked up at me then, his eyes a little shinier than before. You always stood by me. Always will. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Somewhere outside a dog barked and a car rumbled down the street. Life kept moving, even when your heart felt frozen in place. I thought back to the years that had led us here, all the moments that built the bond between us. Scraped knees and broken toys, parent-teacher conferences where the teachers looked at me like I was a sideshow because I didn't use fancy words or wear pressed suits. Nights when Mason had the flu and I slept on the floor beside his bed just to be close if he needed me. Days when I barely had 2 nickels to rub together, but Mason still had lunch money in his pocket. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes, lost my temper sometimes, missed a few school plays when I couldn't get off my shift. But I never missed the big things. Birthdays, graduations, every moment that mattered. And no matter what anyone said about my education or my bank account, no one could ever take that away from me. You remember, I said, leaning back with a creak, the time you broke your arm playing backyard football? Mason chuckled. Yeah, I thought you were going to kill me. I thought you were going to kill me, I said, laughing. You screamed so loud the neighbor came running with a baseball bat thinking we were getting robbed. Mason laughed harder, the tension easing from his shoulders. You carried me 2 blocks to the truck. I was heavy back then. You were heavier because you wouldn't stop crying. We both laughed, the sound filling the small room like sunlight breaking through a storm. For a little while, we weren't the father and son who had just walked out of a ruined wedding. We were just 2 stubborn souls, bruised but unbroken, clinging to the one thing that had never let us down. Each other. Later that night, after Mason went to bed in his old room, I sat out on the porch with another beer, watching the stars blink overhead. The air was cool, the kind that hinted it'd fall just around the corner. I rocked slowly in the porch chair, listening to the night sounds. Crickets, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of the old wood beneath me. I thought about Claw's parents, about all their money, their degrees, their polished words. None of it had taught them kindness. None of it had taught them respect. They had everything a man could want except the one thing that mattered most: heart. And maybe, just maybe, the world had a funny way of balancing things out. I didn't know then what would happen next. I didn't know about the news that would break the following morning, or how the very people who had laughed at me would find themselves the laughingstock of the town. But in that moment, sitting on my porch with the night wrapped around me like an old blanket, I knew one thing for certain. I had already won. I had raised a good man, and no insult, no nameplate, no cruel laughter could ever take that victory away. I took a long sip from the bottle and tipped my head back, smiling up at the stars. Let the world think what it wanted. I knew the truth, and so did my son. There's a certain kind of fight that lives deep inside you when you're a man who's had to claw his way through life with nothing but bare hands and stubbornness. I never planned on being a single father. Nobody plans for something like that. Laura and I thought we had forever. She was the smart one between us, the one with dreams bigger than our little town could hold. When she got sick, it felt like the world tilted sideways, and no matter how hard I tried to straighten it, it never really went back. After she passed, it was just me and Mason. I was 24 years old with a mortgage I couldn't afford, a toddler who cried for his mother every night, and a hole in my chest so wide I didn't think anything would ever fill it. People whispered about me back then. I could hear them in the grocery store when they thought I wasn't listening. Poor kid, he doesn't have a chance. Daniel Cooper's going to mess that boy up. He should just give the kid to Laura's parents. They've got money, education, a proper home. Laura's parents, the Hallways, didn't waste any time. 2 weeks after the funeral, they showed up on my doorstep with a lawyer and a custody petition. I still remember standing on that porch, Mason clinging to my jeans, staring down at Laura's mother with her perfect hair and her eyes sharp enough to cut glass. She looked at me like I was something she found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Be reasonable, Daniel," she said, like she was offering me a deal and not trying to steal my whole world away. "You can't possibly raise him alone. He needs better." I didn't say much, never been the type for fancy speeches. I just told them no, simple as that. They didn't listen, took me to court 3 times, tried to paint me as unfit because I never finished high school, because I worked with my hands, because my house was small and my wallet was even smaller. I'll never forget the feeling of sitting in that courtroom wearing the only tie I owned, listening to their lawyer talk about me like I wasn't even human, like I was just some obstacle standing between them and what they wanted. They had charts and expert witnesses and photographs. I had calloused hands, bloodshot eyes, and the desperate love of a man who had lost everything except his boy. It should have been a slaughter. On paper, I didn't stand a chance, but sometimes God sends you an angel in the ugliest battles. Her name was Julian Price, court-appointed attorney, barely out of law school. She looked like she should still be taking exams, not fighting battles in front of a judge. But she fought for me like I was her own blood. She dragged every dirty trick the Holloways tried into the light. She showed the court what they really cared about. Control, not love. The day the judge ruled in my favor, Mason was curled up on my lap, playing with my work boots. I didn't even hear the first part of the decision. All I heard was the part that mattered. Full custody granted to Mr. Daniel Cooper. I broke down right there in the courtroom. Couldn't help it. Ugly, choking sobs that I tried to swallow but couldn't. Julianne just patted my back awkwardly and said, "You earned this." Don't let anyone tell you different. I didn't. From that day forward, Mason was mine to raise, mine to protect. Every scraped me, every spelling test, every Christmas morning when there was barely enough under the tree but somehow was still magical. I gave it to him with everything I had. Sometimes, late at night when he was little, I'd sit by his bed and just watch him breathe. I was so scared I would screw it all up. that somehow love wouldn't be enough, that maybe the hallways were right and I wasn't good enough. But every morning when Mason woke up and grinned at me with that gap-toed smile, I told myself I could figure it out. And I did. Not perfectly, not by any parenting book standards, but by the only one that mattered: showing up, staying, loving without limits. As he got older, the world didn't get any kinder. Teachers who looked down their noses when I showed up to conferences in my oil-stained boots. Other parents who invited Mason to birthday parties but not me to barbecues. It hurt sometimes, more than I wanted to admit. But Mason never cared. He'd come home from school talking about the kids whose parents had PhDs or corner offices, and I'd brace myself for the day he'd start to wish he had someone better for a father. But it never came. Instead, he'd say things like, "Dad, you're the smartest guy I know. You can fix anything." And he meant it. Not because I could solve algebra problems or negotiate business deals, but because he trusted that when he needed me, I'd always be there. When Mason turned 15, I sat him down and told him about the court battle, told him how close I came to losing him. I thought he deserved to know. I expected anger, maybe, or sadness, but he just sat there quietly, then hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "You didn't lose me, Dad," he said. "You never will." Now, sitting on the porch all these years later, those words came back to me, clear as a bell. After everything, the nameplate, the laughter, the humiliation, none of it could touch that bond. They didn't know the battles we had fought together. They didn't know the nights spent wrapped up in each other's stubborn love. They saw a low-educated mechanic. They didn't see the man who had rebuilt a whole world with 2 battered hands and a heart that refused to quit. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over me. Mason was asleep inside, safe under the same roof that had sheltered him through scraped knees, broken hearts, and teenage rebellions. My boy, my pride, my proof that love didn't need a degree or a pedigree to be real. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning. Maybe it would bring more trouble. Maybe it would bring surprises. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of our little corner of the world, I knew this much. I had chosen to fight for Mason when it mattered most. And I would choose it again 1,000 times over. Because at the end of it all, love wasn't measured in letters after your name. It was measured in the hands that picked you up when you fell, the arms that carried you home when you couldn't walk, the heart that never, not for a single moment, stopped believing you were worth it. And by that measure, I was the richest man alive. There's a certain pride that comes from building something with your own 2 hands, even when no one else sees it. Our life wasn't made of fine things, but it was real. Every crack in the wall, every squeaky step on the stairs, every mismatched plate in the kitchen cabinets, it all told a story. A story of surviving, of laughing when there wasn't much to laugh about, of building a life that was ours. After the custody battle, I was working 2 jobs, days at the factory, nights fixing trucks in the neighbor's garage. Sometimes I'd crawl into bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, too tired to even take my boots off. But when Mason would wander into my room in his footy pajamas and climb onto the bed, curling up against me with a sleepy, "Love you, Dad," it made every aching muscle worth it. I didn't know much about raising a kid the right way. Never had a manual. Never had anyone showing me how to do it. My own father had been long gone before I even hit my teens. It was just me guessing half the time, learning as I went. When Mason had colic and screamed for hours, I paced the floors of our little living room, singing off-key lullabies until he finally slept. When he got older and asked why his mom wasn't here like other kids' moms, I sat him down and told him the truth the only way I knew how, gentle and simple. "She loved you more than anything," I said once, rubbing his back as he blinked up at me with tearful eyes. "And she's watching you every day. You're her best thing." He believed me, and maybe in some ways that belief kept both of us going. Money was tight in those years, real tight. There were days when I skipped dinner just to make sure Mason had enough on his plate, nights when the electricity company threatened to shut us off. I learned how to stretch $1 so far it could snap. Hand-me-down clothes, used toys from the thrift store, school supplies bought late when they were on clearance. But you know something funny? Mason never once complained. Not when he had to wear sneakers with duct tape on the toes. Not when Christmas meant just one present under the tree. Not when his friends had video games and new bikes, and he made do with a football we patched up with shoe glue. Instead, he made me proud in ways I can't even explain. He worked hard at school. He was kind. He helped neighbors rake leaves and shovel snow without being asked. And every time he ran home sweaty and muddy from playing outside, shouting, "Dad, guess what?" like I was the only person in the world he wanted to tell. I knew we were doing just fine. We didn't have a big backyard, but we had enough space for a beat-up old grill and 2 lawn chairs. Every summer, I'd save up for a small camping trip, just me and Mason, and a tent that leaked when it rained. We'd fish in muddy rivers, roast marshmallows until they caught fire, and tell ghost stories that made us both laugh too hard to be scared. Those weekends were messy, cheap, and perfect. One night, Mason must have been about 10. We lay under the stars, staring up at the sky. He rolled onto his side and looked at me with a seriousness that didn't match his missing front teeth. "Are we poor, Dad?" he asked. The question hit harder than any punch. I wanted to lie, wanted to tell him we were just like everyone else. But I didn't want to build our life on lies. I thought about it for a second, then said, "We don't have a lot of money, but we're rich in the stuff that matters." He frowned, confused. "Like what?" "Like love. Like laughs. Like always having someone who's got your back." He nodded thoughtfully, like he was storing that answer away somewhere deep inside him. Then he grinned, crooked and full of life. "Then we're the richest people ever." I laughed so hard that night I scared off half the wildlife in the woods. Time kept moving forward faster than I liked. Mason grew taller, sharper, smarter. He never made me feel small for not knowing the things he was learning in school. Instead, he came home and patiently taught me about algebra, history, and science experiments that half the time ended with the kitchen smelling like burnt sugar. When he made it into college, full scholarship no less, I stood in the driveway the day he left, pretending I wasn't wiping my eyes on my sleeve. He hugged me so tight my ribs ached. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered. "You already have," I choked out. The house felt empty without him, but I kept busy. Fixed up an old motorcycle I've been meaning to get running for years. Started volunteering at the local youth center, teaching kids how to work on engines. It felt good to give back a little, to pass on what I knew. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Mason would call. Sometimes from his dorm room, sometimes from the library. Once from a rainy street corner because his umbrella broke and he wanted to tell me he aced his chemistry exam. No matter how busy he got, he never forgot where he came from. And then years later came the day he called me with shaking excitement in his voice. "Dad," he said, breathless, "I met someone. Claire." At first, I was just happy he was happy. She sounded nice, polite, sweet, maybe a little polished around the edges, but love smooths out the rough spots, right? I didn't think much of it when Mason said her parents were a little formal. Thought maybe they'd warm up once they got to know us. I didn't realize then how much they saw people like me as invisible, as less than, as something to be tolerated at best and humiliated at worst. Maybe I should have seen it coming. But love has a way of making you believe in the best, even when the warning signs are flashing. Still, no matter what happened at that fancy wedding, no matter what bitter laughter tried to rewrite our story, it couldn't erase the life we built together. A life made of hard work and harder love. A life built with calloused hands, stubborn hearts, and the kind of bond that mockery couldn't even scratch. I sat back in my chair that night, listening to Mason's soft breathing through the thin walls of the house, and smiled. They thought they could measure a man by the clothes he wore or the school he graduated from. They had no idea how rich we really were. Growing up, Mason never made me feel like he was embarrassed of me. Not once. Even when the other kids bragged about what their parents did, lawyers, doctors, business owners, Mason would puff out his chest and tell anyone who listened, "My dad can fix anything." He said it like it was the most important job in the world, and to him, maybe it was. When he got older, I worried it would change, that teenage years and peer pressure would make him see the dirt under my nails or the grease stains on my jeans as something shameful. I braced myself for it, honestly, waiting for the day he'd stop inviting me to career days or start hesitating when people asked what his dad did for a living. But that day never came. Instead, I remember the time his high school held a career fair. Kids brought in their parents to talk about what they did. There were engineers and architects and professors with big titles and fancier words than I could follow. I almost told Mason he should pick someone else to stand beside him that day. I didn't want to embarrass him, but he wouldn't hear it. "You're coming, Dad," he said firmly. "You're the smartest man I know." So, I went. Wore my best pair of jeans, a clean work shirt, even combed my hair back like Mason used to when he played dress-up as a kid. I stood next to him while he introduced me to his classmates and teachers. "This is my dad," he said, proud as anything. "He's a mechanic. He can fix cars, trucks, lawnmowers, anything with an engine. He even built a go-kart for me from scratch when I was 10. The kids' faces lit up. Some teachers smiled politely, but a few genuinely looked impressed when Mason told them about how we used scrap parts and still made that little go-kart run like a dream. Driving home that night, Mason leaned over and said, "Some dads wear suits, but mine can build things with his hands. That's way cooler." I don't think he realized what that meant to me. Maybe he never will. Even when he left for college, surrounded by kids from rich families with polished backgrounds, he never stopped being proud of where he came from. He'd send pictures of him in his dorm room, grinning like a fool, a poster of a classic Mustang behind him, a car we had rebuilt together one long, greasy summer. Once during his second year, he brought a few friends home over break. I worried what they'd think of our small house, the cracked driveway, the second-hand furniture, but Mason acted like it was a palace. He showed them the workshop out back where we had spent countless weekends, told them stories about learning to change oil before he learned to drive. He even pointed proudly at my old recliner in the living room and said, "Best chair in the world." Sat there every night listening to my dad's crazy stories. And when one of his friends joked about the tiny kitchen, Mason just laughed and said, "Yeah, but you've never had burgers better than my dad's." He made me feel like I was 10 feet tall. That's what love does. It doesn't hide you in the shadows. It shines a light on you, even when the rest of the world looks away. Claire entered his life not long after that. I could tell he was head over heels from the start. He talked about her like she was made of sunlight. She was smart, top of her class, working toward a career in international law. Mason couldn't stop grinning whenever he mentioned her. The first time we met, she was polite, a little stiff maybe, but kind enough. I chalked it up to nerves. Not everyone knows what to say to a man who makes his living elbow-deep in engines. Her smile was tight, her words careful, like she was afraid to step in oil just by standing next to me. But Mason looked at her like she hung the moon, and that was enough for me. It wasn't until later at family gatherings and dinners that I noticed the small cracks. The way her parents would talk over me at the table using words meant to confuse or belittle. The way Claire would sometimes wheeze when I mentioned work like I had said something unnivelized. The way she introduced me to her friends once, not as Mason's dad, but as the man who fixed our car. Still, I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe I wasn't their kind of people. Maybe they just needed time. Maybe love could smooth it over the way it always had before. But now, looking back after what happened at the wedding, I realize love alone isn't always enough to bridge certain gaps, especially the kind built from pride and prejudice. I remember one particular conversation with Mason about 6 months before the wedding. We were fixing up the porch swing, replacing a few rotten boards. He was hammering away while I held the new slat steady. "You think Claire's parents like me?" he asked out of nowhere. I shrugged, careful with my words. "They don't know you like I do. Give it time." He nodded, but the furrow between his eyebrows stayed. "Sometimes I think they see me as, I don't know, not good enough," he muttered, more to the nails than to me. I sat down the slat and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Listen, son," I said carefully. "Some people are born thinking they're better than others because of where they went to school or how many zeros are on their paycheck. That's their problem, not yours. You measure a man by how he treats the people who can't do anything for him. By his heart, not his wallet." Mason didn't say anything for a long moment, just kept hammering, but his jaw was sad, and I could tell he was storing those words away the same way he always did when something mattered. Maybe that's why on the day of the wedding, when he saw that awful nameplate and heard the laughter, he didn't hesitate. He remembered what mattered. He chose love over appearances. He chose respect over status. He chose me, not because I was the perfect father. Not because I had wealth or titles to offer, but because when everything else was stripped away, money, education, fancy suits, and big houses, what was left was a bond built from years of late nights, early mornings, scraped knees, burned dinners, repaired engines, bedtime stories, and 1,000 little moments of showing up. And sometimes that's more than enough. Sometimes it's everything. The Whitmores were the kind of family that wore their pride like armor. Everything about them was polished, rehearsed, and just a little too perfect. From the first time I met them at a dinner party Claire's parents threw, I could feel the difference. They spoke in clipped, proper tones, like every word was a carefully measured performance. They shook hands too firmly, smiled too tightly, and when they talked about their achievements, degrees, investments, business ventures, it wasn't conversation, it was competition. I tried to fit in. God knows I tried. I showed up in the best clothes I could afford, kept my elbows off the table, minded my manners the way Laura had once taught me. I smiled when they dropped fancy terms about stocks and private equity. I nodded politely when Dr. Whitmore bragged about the prestigious universities in their family line like it was a crown he wore. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. They didn't see me as a man who had raised a son through blood, sweat, and broken dreams. They didn't see the father who had stayed up for days to nurse a sick boy back to health, who had learned how to braid hair for school plays, who had taught a child how to ride a bike by running behind him for hours even though his legs screamed with pain. They didn't see love. They saw dirt under my nails and a high school dropout. They saw someone they couldn't parade in their cocktail parties or drop into conversations with their ivory tower friends. Still, I held my tongue for Mason's sake. I smiled when they talked down to me, laughed when they made jokes that stung, and swallowed my pride like a bitter pill. Because Mason was happy. Because I believed, foolishly maybe, that marriage would build bridges where words had failed. In the weeks leading up to the wedding there were signs. Small ones. Claire gently suggesting I get a new suit, something more appropriate for the venue.
Judith Whitmore, offering to arrange a speech coach if I wanted to say a few words at the reception, said with a syrupy sweetness that barely hid the insult. Dr. Whitmore sending me an etiquette book in the mail with a note. A little light reading before the big day. I could have gotten angry. Lord knows a younger version of me might have thrown those words right back at them. But years of raising Mason had taught me patience, taught me to pick my battles. I wasn't about to cause a scene and embarrass Mason at his own wedding, so I tucked my hurt deep inside. I smiled through tight teeth. I told myself that one day when Mason had a family of his own, when he held his own child in his arms, he'd understand that sometimes love meant swallowing your pride so your kids could have their day. I wore the new suit, stiff and uncomfortable. It felt like a costume instead of clothing. I practiced my manners. I sat quietly through endless dinners where they discussed vacations I could never afford and schools I could never dream of entering. I endured it all for Mason. The morning of the wedding, I woke early, too early. I made a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the sunrise. I thought about Laura, how proud she would have been. I thought about the little boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares, and how he was now a grown man about to start his own life. I told myself that today would be about Mason, not about me, not about the Whitmore. I tucked my hands into the pockets of my new suit and whispered to the empty kitchen. You did good, Laura. We did good. I drove to the venue with my heart in my throat. The ballroom was grander than I had imagined. Glittering chandeliers, gold-trimmed walls, music floating through the air like perfume. Guests in tuxedos and silk dresses floated around like it was some kind of royal ball. I felt like a bull that had wandered into a china shop. Still, I smiled. I shook hands. I let Judith kiss my cheek and pretended not to notice the way she immediately wiped her hand on her dress. I even laughed at Dr. Whitmore's jokes, even though every word dripped with condescension. Then came the moment that shattered it all. I walked to my assigned seat, tried to ignore the sideways glances, the whispers. When I bent down to read the nameplate on my chair, it felt like someone punched the air right out of my chest. Load, educated, fake dad. I stared at it, blinking, hoping it would change if I looked long enough, but it didn't. The letters were crisp, deliberate, cruel. The laughter started softly, a titter here, a snicker there. Then it grew ugly, mean. Judith covering her mouth with her hand but failing to hide the sparkle in her eyes. Dr. Whitmore shaking his head and mock sympathy. I wanted to disappear, wanted to sink into the marble floor and never be seen again. But before I could move, before the humiliation could finish crushing me, Mason's voice cut through the noise. Dad. I turned. He was standing at the altar halfway to me, eyes blazing. Let's go home. Without hesitation, he crossed the room, took my arm, and together we walked out. Past the whispers, past the gasps, past the perfect people in their perfect clothes with their perfect lives. Claire didn't follow. Judith didn't call out. Dr. Whitmore didn't move. They let us go like we were the ones unworthy. Outside, the sun was blinding. Mason held the car door open for me like he had 100 times before when he was a boy pretending to be a chauffeur. I slid into the passenger seat, my heart too full to speak. He drove in silence for a while, hands tied on the steering wheel.
"I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally, voice rough. "I should have seen it sooner." I shook my head. "You saw it when it mattered." At a red light, he turned to me. "I don't care about degrees or bank accounts or any of that crap. You're my father. You're my family." Tears burned my eyes, but I blinked them away. That day I realized something important. Family isn't built in ballrooms or sealed with degrees. It's built in the trenches. One scraped knee, one missed meal, one whispered bedtime story at a time. They could keep their chandeliers and champagne. I had something they would never understand. I had my son's loyalty, and nothing in the world could make me richer than that. The morning after Mason's wedding that wasn't, I woke up before the sun. I couldn't sleep no matter how tired I was. My mind kept replaying everything from the night before, the mocking laughter, that awful nameplate, the heavy silence. As we left the ballroom, I sat on the porch with a mug of coffee that had gone cold in my hands. Staring out into the gray light of dawn, the world was still turning. Birds were singing. Somewhere across town, people were waking up to their ordinary lives. But for me, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't angry. Not exactly. I was past anger. What I felt now was something deeper, heavier. A sadness for the way people could twist love into something cruel. I wondered what would happen now. Mason hadn't said much after we got home last night. Just sat on the couch for a long time, staring at nothing. He finally fell asleep sitting up, head tilted against the wall like he had when he was a kid riding in the back seat after a long day. I didn't wake him. I just covered him with a blanket and sat nearby, keeping watch like I always had. I was sipping my second cup of coffee when I heard the rumble of an engine pulling up. I squinted down the driveway and saw Mason's old pickup rolling in. A little battered, a little dusty. It was Theo, his best friend since high school. Theo hopped out, still in his mechanic's uniform, and jogged up to the porch. "You seen the news?" he asked, panting like he had run the whole way. I frowned. "News?" Theo shoved his phone at me, the screen already lit up with headlines. "Whit?" I stared at it, unblinking. Below the headline was a photo of Claire's father, Dr. Whitmore, looking grim as reporters crowded around him. Another article headline flashed below it. "Sources claim family fortune at risk as authorities move in." My first reaction wasn't joy. It wasn't even satisfaction. It was shock. Theo kept talking, excitement tumbling out of him. Someone leaked a bunch of documents last night. Emails, bank statements, internal memos. It's everywhere. The SEC's involved. They're saying Whitmore Industries has been cooking their books for years. I set the phone down slowly. My heart was pounding, but my mind felt strangely calm. Was it karma? Was it justice? I didn't know. All I knew was that the very people who had laughed at me, who had called me a fake, who had tried to make me feel small, they were crumbling under the weight of their own lies. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Mason standing in the doorway, hair sticking up in all directions, blankets still wrapped around his shoulders. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I exchanged a look with Theo, then handed Mason the phone. He read the headlines, his eyes widening with every word. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at the screen like it was written in a language he didn't understand. Then, slowly, he let out a breath and sank down onto the porch steps. I don't even know what to feel," he said finally. I sat down beside him. "You don't have to feel anything right now. Just breathe." Theo clapped him on the shoulder. "Better to find out now than later, man." Mason nodded, still staring off into the distance. I almost married into that mess. "You didn't?" I said quietly. "You saw the truth when it mattered. We sat there in silence, the three of us, while the sun crept higher and the world around us started to buzz with life. I could hear the neighbors' sprinklers kicking on. Someone down the street was mowing their lawn. It was just another Saturday for most people, but for us, it was the first day of a different life. Around noon, Mason's phone started blowing up. Calls, texts, voicemails. Some were from Claire, some were from her parents. Some were from people who had been at the wedding, desperate to know what we knew, if we had been part of the leak. Mason didn't answer a single one. He just sat there staring at the phone, shaking his head. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think they ever loved me, or was it always about appearances?" I hated that question, hated that he even had to ask it. "I think they love the idea of you," I said. Carefully, the image, the connection. But real love doesn't humiliate. It doesn't mock. It doesn't care about where you came from or what you wear or what you do for a living. It shows up when you fall. It holds on when things get ugly. Mason swallowed hard. "I don't think they ever really saw me." "They didn't deserve to," I said simply. In the afternoon, the news got worse for the Whitmores. More documents surfaced. Anonymous sources came forward. Former employees spoke to the press. It was a tidal wave, and no matter how hard they tried to spin it, they were drowning. Theo eventually left to get back to work. Mason and I stayed on the porch watching it all unfold from a battered old laptop he set up on the table between us. At one point, we saw a live clip of Dr. Whitmore being swarmed by reporters outside his office. His face was pale, drawn, nothing like the smug man who had smirked at me across the ballroom just a day before. Judith was there too, clutching her pearls like they could save her. Claire wasn't visible in the crowd. Maybe she was hiding. Maybe she was just smart enough to stay away. Mason watched for a few minutes, then closed the laptop with a sigh. "I don't want anything from them," he said. "Not their money, not their apologies. Nothing. You don't need anything from them." I said, "You've got everything you need right here." He looked at me, then really looked at me. And for the first time in a long time, I saw peace in his eyes. Maybe not happiness yet, but peace. That night, we grilled burgers in the backyard. Just the two of us. No fancy dishes, no white tablecloths, just two plates balanced on our knees, ketchup dripping down our fingers, laughter filling the warm summer air. We didn't talk about the Whitmore. We didn't talk about the wedding. We just talked about life, about dreams, about the future. Mason told me he was thinking about starting his own business, something simple, something honest. Maybe a garage of his own. Maybe teaching kids how to work on cars the way I had taught him. I told him I thought that sounded just about perfect. As the stars came out overhead, I realized something important. The storm had passed, and even though the world had tried to tear us down, even though the laughter still echoed faintly in the back of my mind, it didn't matter anymore. We were still standing, still together, still undefeated. The next few days passed like a blur, but underneath it all, something kept pulling at me. A memory. A secret that I had tucked away so tightly even Mason didn't know about it. It started years ago after Laura passed, right around the time I won custody of Mason. I didn't have much. An old house, an older truck, a few thousand Laura's life insurance had left behind. It wasn't enough to live comfortably, not by a long shot, but it was something, and I knew I had to make it count. One afternoon, when Mason was still in diapers, I walked into a community center that offered free financial advice for low-income families. I didn't know anything about stocks or investments. I barely understood savings accounts, but I sat through every workshop, read every battered pamphlet they handed me, and asked 1,000 questions. I wanted to be ready for anything life threw at us. It was there I learned about investing small amounts into companies, not big flashy gambling. Smart, patient investing little by little, year after year. And funny enough, one of the companies I had put a small chunk of Laura's insurance money into was Whitmore Industries. Back then, they weren't the giant they became later, just another mid-sized manufacturing company. Their stock was cheap, their prospects decent. I figured, why not? It wasn't a fortune, just a few hundred here and there. Enough that over the years, as Whitmore Industries grew into a giant, so did my shares. I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't seem important. It was just a quiet thing I did in the background, like fixing the leaky faucet or making sure Mason had enough money for school books. By the time Mason went to college, I had accumulated a surprising number of shares, enough to be considered what they called a minor silent investor. Not enough to sit on their board or throw weight around, but enough that when I sold them, someone would notice. I hadn't touched those shares in years. They just sat there quietly, growing like a tree planted in a forgotten field until the night of the wedding. When I saw that nameplate, when I heard the laughter, something in me snapped. Not in anger, not in revenge, in clarity. The people who sat there mocking me thought I was nothing. They didn't know I owned a small part of the empire they bragged about. They didn't know that with one phone call, I could make their comfortable little world tilt sideways. So I did. I waited until Mason and I got home. Waited until he had fallen asleep on the couch, blanket pulled up to his chin like he was a boy again. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out the old laptop I barely used anymore, and logged into my investment account. There they were, hundreds of shares, enough to matter. I didn't hesitate. I clicked sell. I didn't just sell them to the market. I directed them to a competitor I had researched months earlier, a company that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The transfer went through in less than 20 minutes. By morning, it would be done, and I would be free of them. I didn't do it to destroy them. Honestly, that wasn't even my first thought. I did it because I realized I didn't owe them anything. Not my silence, not my respect, not my investment in their future. They had already decided what I was worth. They forgot to check who was holding part of their house up. The next morning, the fallout began. News outlets sniffed out the sale quickly. Speculation ran wild. People panicked. Stocks plummeted. Investigations kicked up dust the Whitmores had spent years trying to sweep under expensive rugs. It was chaos. Beautiful, ugly chaos. And all the while, I said nothing. Mason didn't know. No one did. It was my quiet goodbye to people who never deserved a hello. I watched it all unfold with a strange calm. No gloating, no fist pumping. Just the same steady feeling I had whenever I finished fixing an engine. Satisfaction that the work was done, that the gears had turned the way they were supposed to. One night, a few days after the collapse started, Mason and I sat on the porch again. We hadn't said much about the Whitmore lately. It was like we had both agreed without speaking to let the past stay where it was. But that night, Mason turned to me with a frown. "You ever feel bad?" he asked. "That losing everything?" I thought about it for a long minute. "No," I said finally. Because what they built was hollow. It was built on lies, on hurting people smaller than them. It was always going to fall. They just didn't think it would happen so soon. Mason nodded, staring out at the stars. "You think Claire knew?" he asked after a while. I shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. Doesn't change anything. He sat quietly, shoulders hunched like he was carrying something heavy. I reached over and clapped a hand on his back. "You don't owe them anything, Mason," I said. "Not your guilt, not your regret. Sometimes when a house catches fire, it's not your job to run back inside. He let out a shaky breath. I wanted it to be real, you know. The love, the family, all of it. I know, son, I said softly, and it will be one day with someone who doesn't need to measure your worth before they decide to love you. We sat in silence after that, comfortable, steady, like two stones in a river, weathered but unmovable. Inside the house, the old clock ticked on. The world turned, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. A week later, I officially closed my investment account, sold off the rest of the small pieces I'd gathered over the years. I didn't need them anymore. Didn't need the security blanket. We had something better. We had each other. And we had freedom. Sometimes it's the unseen hands that shape the world the most. The ones nobody notices. The ones the rich and powerful laugh at, dismiss, or forget, until those hands quietly let go. And everything they thought was unshakable starts to fall. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their apology. I didn't even need them to know it was me. The only thing I needed was already sitting beside me on that porch. A son who had chosen me, and a life that no amount of money could ever replace. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. After everything that happened, the wedding disaster, the collapse of Whitmore Industries, the endless stream of news articles painting Claire's family in a new, uglier light, I thought Mason might be broken for a long time, thought he might wall himself off, become hard and bitter like some men do after betrayal. But that's not the kind of man Mason was raised to be. Slowly, like the first stubborn buds pushing through frozen soil, he started to heal. It began with small things. He got up early again, started fixing things around the house without being asked. Changed the oil in the truck, painted the porch railing. Little tasks that might have seemed meaningless to someone else but meant the world to me. They meant he was choosing life over anger, movement over bitterness. One morning I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a pile of notebooks and a laptop spread out in front of him. "What's all this?" I asked, pouring myself a coffee. He looked up, his eyes brighter than I'd seen them in weeks. "I'm thinking about starting my own garage, Dad." I blinked. "Your own business?" He nodded. "Not just repairs. Teaching, too. Classes for high school kids who want to learn a trade. Apprenticeships. Real work with real skills." Pride surged so fast in my chest it almost knocked me over. "That's a damn good idea, son," I said, smiling so wide my cheeks hurt. He grinned back a little sheepishly. "Figured it was about time I started building something real, something that matters." Over the next few weeks, Mason threw himself into planning. He found an old building on the edge of town, an abandoned mechanics shop with cracked windows and a roof that needed fixing. It was a mess, but it had good bones, just like Mason. Strong, steady, built to last. I helped him every step of the way. We patched drywall, replaced broken tiles, cleaned out years of dust and grime. Some nights we worked until midnight, covered in paint and sweat, laughing about how sore we'd be in the morning. But there was joy in the work, a kind of sacred satisfaction that money couldn't buy. And somewhere along the way, something even better happened. Mason met Leah. It wasn't some grand movie moment with fireworks and slow motion running across a field. It was simpler than that. Realer. She worked at the hardware store where Mason and I made what felt like 100 trips every week. Short woman, big brown eyes, calluses on her hands from working the floor. No makeup, no airs, just a bright laugh and a way of talking that made you feel like you mattered. I saw it happen almost in slow motion. One afternoon, Mason was arguing with the clerk about the difference between two brands of sealant. When Leah stepped in, patiently explained the difference and gave Mason a smile that turned him into a stammering fool. That night he couldn't stop talking about her. "She's smart, Dad," he said, practically glowing. She knows more about tools than I do. I just smiled and said, "Sounds like you finally met your match." It didn't take long. A few coffee dates turned into dinners. Dinners turned into long walks through the park. Long walks turned into nights when Mason came home humming under his breath, like a man with a brand new song in his heart. He brought her over to dinner a month later. I made my famous burgers on the grill and we ate out back under the stars. Leah fit right in, laughing at our terrible jokes, teasing Mason about how he still couldn't remember the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. But what struck me most was how she looked at him. Not like he was surprised to be one, not like he was a stepping stone to a better life. She looked at him like he was already enough. And for a man who had spent too many months questioning his worth, that look was everything. Later that night, after Leah had gone home and Mason and I were cleaning up, he turned to me, shy and serious. "I think she's the one, Dad." I clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You'll know when the time's right. You'll know." And he did. 3 months later, Mason proposed. Nothing fancy, no flash mobs or choreographed dances. Just a quiet evening in the little shop. He was still fixing up, kneeling on one dusty knee with a simple ring and a heart full of hope. Leah said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was a small affair, backyard under the old oak tree that Mason used to climb as a boy. Close friends, a few neighbors, Theo as the best man. No fancy nameplates, no marble halls. No one cared about degrees or income brackets. All that mattered was the laughter that filled the air, and the tears that filled my eyes, as I watched my son marry a woman who saw him for everything he was, and nothing he wasn't. When they exchanged vows, Mason didn't talk about wealth or appearances. He talked about loyalty, about late nights fixing broken things together, about love built through work and patience and stubborn hope. When it was over and Mason and Leah danced barefoot in the grass, I sat back in a lawn chair, a cold beer in my hand, and felt a peace deeper than any I'd ever known. We had come full circle, from a courtroom where I fought to keep my son, to a ballroom where they tried to laugh me away, to a backyard where real love finally stood tall and proud. Later that night, Mason found me sitting on the porch steps watching the stars. He dropped down beside me, still in his wedding clothes, tie, loose hair, a mess from all the dancing. "Thanks for everything, Dad," he said quietly. "You did this yourself, son," I replied. "You built this life. You chose it." He shook his head. "I wouldn't have known how to choose it if you hadn't shown me first." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Just sat there shoulder to shoulder, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. And I realized something. The battles I had fought, the humiliation, the sacrifices, the loneliness, they had all been worth it. Every scraped knuckle, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer when I didn't know how we were going to make it. Because they led to this, to a son who knew what real love looked like, and a life richer than any fortune could buy. Sometimes, I sit on the porch in the evenings, a cold drink in my hand, watching the sunset bleed across the sky. I rock slowly in my old chair, the wood creaking under my weight, and I think about the life I built, not with bricks or blueprints, but with hands that stayed steady when the storms came. I watch Mason through the open window inside the house he helped rebuild with Leah. Their twins, Lily and Jack, tumble across the living room floor, a blur of giggles and tiny socked feet. Leah chases them, laughing breathlessly while Mason pretends to be a growling bear crawling after them on all fours. Their home is simple, like mine always was. No grand chandeliers, no marble floors, just a place built with love, passed with patience, and filled with a laughter so real it hums in your bones. Every so often, Mason glances out the window at me, grins, and waves. I waved back, feeling something settled deep inside me, something stronger than pride, deeper than satisfaction. Peace. Years ago, when Claire's family tried to shame me at that wedding, I thought maybe they had stolen something from me. Maybe they had left a mark that would never heal. But now, looking at the life Mason and Leah have made, I realized the truth. They didn't steal anything. They only revealed what had been strong all along. Family isn't measured by titles or wealth or the kind of degrees you hang on the wall. It's measured by who shows up, who stays, who loves you when loving you isn't fashionable. It's measured by scraped knees kissed better, by broken hearts patiently mended, by old trucks kept running longer than they should. It's measured by two tired hands that built a life out of nothing but grit and a whole lot of stubborn hope. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the evening breeze brush against my face. I think about Laura, about the promises we made when we were young and reckless and thought we had all the time in the world. I like to believe she's still watching somewhere beyond the clouds, smiling at the life we carved out of heartbreak and hard days. I imagine her sitting beside me now, laughing that soft laugh she always had, reaching over to squeeze my, "You both did good." Sometimes Mason comes out after the kids are in bed carrying 2 beers. He'll sit beside me, stretching his long legs out in front of him, and we'll talk about nothing and everything. About how Jack thinks he's a dinosaur. About how Lily refuses to go to sleep unless she hears 3 bedtime stories in a row. About how scary it is to raise kids, to wonder if you're doing it right, to worry you're making mistakes you can't see yet. "I get scared sometimes, Dad," he admitted once, staring up at the stars. "Scared I'll mess it all up." I chuckled low in my throat, took a slow sip of my drink, and said, "Welcome to being a parent." He laughed, shaking his head. "But you made it look easy." I turned to look at him, then at the strong, kind man he had become. "It wasn't easy," I said. "Not for a single minute. I just loved you enough to make it through." That's the secret no one tells you about family, about life. It's not about getting everything right. It's not about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time. About showing up even when you're tired, even when you're scared, even when you don't have a clue what you're doing. It's about loving so hard that all the broken pieces start to fit together in new ways. And sitting there beside my son under a sky full of stars, I realized something else. The Whiters had laughed at me once, called me a low-educated fake dad, tried to paint me as less than. But none of that mattered anymore, because while their empire crumbled, while their carefully constructed lives unraveled in headlines and courtrooms, my life was here, alive, breathing, growing stronger every day. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Mason built his garage up from the ground. It's a small place with grease-stained floors and a giant hand-painted sign that reads, "Cooper's Garage." Honest work, honest people. Every day, kids from the high school come by after classes to learn how to fix engines, change oil, patch tires. Mason teaches them with the same patience I once taught him. Leah runs the front office, twin strapped to her hips more often than not, managing invoices and ordering parts with a baby on each arm. Sometimes when I visit, the kids call me Mr. Cooper or Coach and ask me to show them tricks on old carburetors. I teach them everything I know, just like I did with Mason. Watching them grin with grease on their faces, I realized that somehow, without even planning it, we built something bigger than just a life. We built a legacy. A place where kids who felt overlooked could find pride in their hands, in their skills, in the knowledge that they mattered. And Mason, he stands at the heart of it all. Not because of a fancy name, not because of a silver spoon, because he knows what real value looks like, because he was raised on it. One night, after a long day at the shop, Mason found me again on the porch. He sat down beside me without a word, handed me a cold beer, and stared out at the field stretching under the moonlight. After a while, he spoke. "Thanks for fighting for me, Dad. For everything." I clinked my bottle against his and said, "Always." Because that's what real fathers do. They show up. They stay. They love even when it's hard, when it's messy, when the world tells them they're not enough. They prove the world wrong, not with speeches or money or shiny things, but with the simple, stubborn act of being there. And tonight, as I sit here rocking under the wide, open sky, I know that no matter what the world tried to say about me, I was never a fake father. I was never low anything. I was a real man, a real father, and I had built a life that no laughter, no cruelty, no nameplate could ever erase.